For the next 60 or so seconds, whenever I decide to call time, because as an instructor I have that prerogative, I want you to write down, just briefly scratch down some notes about your reactions to an impression of news media coverage you have seen about suicide. Reactions to an impression of coverage you have seen about suicide. Now this is news coverage, not entertainment. We'll make sure we keep those separate. So, do we have some people who want to share? Please share. Yes.
So the first couple things I wrote down were just powerful, important, necessary, and revealing. The instance that just kept dominating my brain was the ESPN magazine story about the University of Pennsylvania runner who jumped off a parking garage. And that's one of my favorite magazine stories of all time. I've read it more than one time. I read it often. So like that was the instance of like coverage that kept sticking out. I think that story is like well done in pretty much every single way. So
Yes, Professor.
That's interesting. I hit different too. The words I put were rudimentary, superficial, and cliched. And I think that we don't often go below the surface and explore like the how and the why. We look at, it is really difficult to look out of another person's head, so we sort of put our own, as reporters, kind of preconceived notions and even stigmatization on suicide without really understanding what we're reporting on or what could get someone to the point that that is an option, because I think it's really difficult for people who aren't there to ever feel that. So I don't, with the notable exceptions, and I mean there are certainly exceptions in the coverage, I think we are so afraid of offending anyone and so afraid of crossing boundaries that we're not even sure those boundaries exist, that we just kind of go with a superficial accounting whether we want to address it.
Okay. Others? Thank you. Anybody else? Everybody was busy scratching and writing. Please share.
but just piggybacking off what Nicole said, I mean,
Hold that thought.
I just said they're usually more unsettling than something like a murder story.
Okay.
I think it's more unsettling to read about suicide, especially like Nicole said, you don't get any more details. They're very short.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
yeah, so I think there's like two different kinds. So obviously I have like the immediate coverage, and I think part of why it does feel, and I also wrote nervous as one of them, because I feel like reporters are nervous about it, but usually because there's so many questions from the families and the friends too, that it's hard for them to like disseminate any information. Yeah, and so like that's what like the difference between like the ESPN and the magazine story was, that it had kind of happened after the fact, and you were able to say like, wasn't this immediate thing? So the family was a little bit maybe more comfortable talking about it, and I mean, so like I mean I have multiple instances of connections with this, and when I was a senior, one of my friends took his own life. And it rocked our whole school, and so often it focused on like us, like how like we came together. And my high school also dealt with a car accident that killed 4 students a couple years prior, and so the focus when that happened, when Anthony passed, was about like how we're so strong as a community coming together, and it very rarely focused on Anthony as well. So I think that sometimes you see that coverage because I don't still know what happened to Anthony. It's been 4 years, so that like was hard for the reporter to, I think, do it. So I think that hinders the coverage a lot of times too.
We see a lot of diversity in reporting, but it sometimes matters when it's done and how it's done, and if there's follow-up.
Yes.
Yeah, I certainly see a lack of empathy or human element to the deceased in that situation, because the why can often not be answered, and so. Yeah, the base level reporting's there, the immediate coverage, and then how do you put words on a page that convey human element of who's now gone or the family that's going through that. So you focus on things like community and things you can see and how siblings may react to it. I often see like a young sibling quote of like their sibling's gone, or an immediate family member, and it's like, and right afterwards that might not be the best time to get a quote. And they're trying to grab something that gives a story emotion aside from a fact and a time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else want to share what you see, heard, viewed, read? Okay, let's go through this list then. How was the story framed? And just to lift up your hands, if this applies, and you can lift up your hand more than once, assuming you have seen more than one example of coverage. Suicide is a tragedy that rips a community apart. Raise your hand if you have seen that presented in media coverage. Okay, suicide is a result of a mental illness. Anyone? Okay, a few hands. Suicide is caused by a single event in a person's life. Suicide is the result of a dead person's selfish behavior or need for attention. Lift a hand if you have seen that. Yeah, the lack of humanity was part of that. Suicide is a loss, but the community and lost survivors can take action toward recovery. That's what many of you have shared. How about suicide as a crime? Commit suicide. Okay. We're going to explore this a little bit more in depth as we go through the rest of this workshop, but we want you to have a chance to hear from a couple of suicide survivors.
The interesting thing about my story is not how I tried to kill myself. The interesting thing about my story is what led up to it. What were those factors? Being in an abusive relationship, living in a house where there was severe addiction. And then what happened after, my situation with the first responders, my situation in the hospital, how I healed, how I taught myself new coping mechanisms. That's the interesting part, and they don't want to hear that. I think the thing that convinced me to want to keep living was my experience with the hospital, my experience with first responders. It was bad. It was not the worst I've heard of, but there was no compassion there. There was mostly silence aimed at me. It felt like resentment. So I sat there for a long time thinking about what I'd done, with my little dunce cap, and the experience of trying to die and being led through that hospital situation made me realize something needed to change. Everything needed to change. It's about constantly being cognizant of what helps, and also what hurts, and avoiding that.
There were most likely several factors that impacted my son's decision to die. In hindsight, I can see those. At the time, I couldn't necessarily see them. His sophomore year, he told me that he was suicidal, his sophomore year of high school. And we got him some help, but it seemed to go away. He seemed fine. And he took his life the end of his senior year. It was right after he graduated high school, actually. And when I look back, I can see things like the anger that was playing out that I didn't realize was a sign of depression, the drinking that was potentially there because he was trying to deal with depression, bad coping mechanism. He was taking medication for acne that had a side effect of suicidal ideation. He had a friend that had taken his life a year prior. Actually, one of the last things my son said through that night, he had been tweeting, was R.I.P. in this boy's name. So there were several factors that went into my son's decision to take his life.
There was a lot of dark and stormy night language, and the reporter insisted on using my method. And he said, well, it's non-disclosure, and if you don't tell me, I'm going to pull it.
When my son died, there was no immediate media coverage. There was coverage starting about 18 months later as I started to find my voice in this space. And I've been in the newspaper and on the news several times, and when I think about some of those reporters and what went well and what didn't go well, initially I would say most people got a B. The TV interviews in particular got a B. They would say things like commit suicide, even though I tried to encourage them to say died by suicide. So it's in their vernacular. So sometimes that didn't go so well. But generally it was okay. It was okay. They didn't try to how I want to say it. They didn't try to simplify his suicide. They talked about a variety of factors, and the first few interviews, I would say they did a nice job of including the suicide prevention hotline number and really casting a vision of hope.
Live Through This is a series of portraits and stories of 170 suicide attempt survivors across the United States. I'm always talking to people on Twitter about suicide, about resources. My Twitter and Facebook feeds are constant. I schedule them in advance. I pre-write tweets with resources, with images.
A few days after my son died, a woman whom I barely knew that went to my church came to visit me, and I knew her as the woman whose son took his life. I didn't know when he did it. I just knew that's who she was. She came to visit me, and she didn't have anything magical to say. She sat with me. She cried with me. She let me ask her really horrific questions, details about it that I needed that for whatever reason. I needed to hear from somebody else that had the same horrible story, that they were still moving along. And I didn't know it at the time, but she did plant seeds of hope that day. And as the months went on, I started thinking about what do people do that don't have the kind of support that I had. Franklin County LOSS stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. We launched in November of 2014 by going to the coroner's office and talking to them about the importance of trained volunteer survivors of a suicide loss being there to support people that are left behind after a suicide. And after some work, the coroner's office was agreeable to us being called out to support people. And we've been doing that now for 2 years. And ultimately, we're there to be an installation of hope to the folks that are left behind. So over the past 2 years, since our LOSS team launched, we have been on approximately 80 scenes of suicides in the Columbus area. And then we've supported, even beyond that, hundreds of people beyond those scenes. On another occasion, I had a reporter from a newspaper call me and express an interest in riding along with some of the volunteers when we get called to the scene of a suicide to support people that are left behind. And I was pretty adamant that that was not going to happen. And his secondary question was, well, would it be okay if I interviewed you right after you were there? And I said, well, what kinds of questions would you ask? And he was prepared to ask questions like method and race, age, information such as that. And that was just absolutely unacceptable. And I would go as far as to say that during this conversation, this reporter bullied me and really shamed me for not being willing to share things like method, because that was so basic that I should know that and I should be willing to share that. And he threatened to go to somebody else for a story, and I said that that was fine, and that is what he did. He ended up going outside of our community to a team who does a similar service and spoke with them for the story. He gets an F. One of the things that really came across loud and clear was that he was just doing his job. He didn't talk to me as a human being, as a mom. At one point during the phone conversation, I said, you know who you're talking to, right? My son died by suicide. I'm a mom. He had just been saying such cold things and just treating this clearly like it was his job, and it was really hurtful. And the more he talked, the more I closed up.
It's almost ironic that journalists, of all people, forget the power of language. With the topic of suicide in the media, what we should be doing is drawing back, being careful with our words. Not necessarily censoring our words, but being careful with our words.
If the media were to do a story right now, and they left it completely up to me, a story about my son and my son's suicide, the story would be certainly about his life and not just about how he chose death. But most importantly, it would include the basics like how to help a friend, who's feeling suicidal, don't be afraid to ask the question, are you thinking of suicide? I'm worried about you. People need permission to have those basic conversations, and I think a good media story would include that.
What I want journalists to know is that the stories that they're covering about suicide are about real people, and that they should take the lead from those people. I think journalists have a lot of power, and I think that we as normal everyday people have a lot of power. So I try to spend a lot of time educating people about that. That you do have the power to save a life, and it's very simple. It's so simple as to be counterintuitive. You just have to start with asking a question. Do you want to kill yourself?
All right, so I think one of the first places that I like to start are one of the myths that we have is that individuals who deal with depression and suicide are weak. These are two of the strongest individuals that I know personally, and it was wonderful of them to agree to step foot in front of film and tell their personal stories. And I think it's just an idea that we can tell stories, we should tell stories that matter, and hopefully that's the hopeful message that we'll give today, and not just the fact that we are talking about a difficult subject. So thank you guys for being willing to be here to talk about these things. I want to set the stage by talking about why suicide prevention and why telling stories about this topic are so critical for us to be able to do. When we think about it, the most recent statistics that are out, we lose 44,000 individuals to suicide. So if we think about that in a year, those numbers are really hard to place. But if you think about filling up the shoe for a Saturday game, and we lose about half of that stadium every year to suicide. That's a gigantic number. And it's a number, unfortunately, that has not gone down over the years. We want to make sure that we are looking towards using strategies that work, that we don't sensationalize it or make sure that we're not talking about it in a way that is unhelpful. And we also want to look at the fact that when we talk about individuals who lose their lives and who are susceptible to some of these unhelpful reporting strategies, we also want to know that youth are at risk and that we lose about 2,000 youth per year, children and teenagers. And if we compare that to the number of individuals we lost during 9/11, that was about 3,000 individuals. But every 18 months we have another 9/11. So this isn't to dramatize the situation. It's just to me that we haven't made much progress, and that we need to start using more effective strategies. We need to make sure that our entire communities are on board with moving forward. We also want to know that every single suicide, despite these numbers, every single suicide that we have impacts a community, impacts a family, impacts a workplace, impacts a faith-based community, and things like that. So we really want to make sure that we are identifying how that individual loss affects the community, and so we really want to take a look at how to humanize the story, how to make sure that we're not glossing over these numbers. I'd also like to add to the fact that to understand what these trends mean, we have to understand that suicide is a public health problem. It's certainly not a crime. It's certainly not something that we want to not talk about at all. So we want to look at the fact that across every age and demographic category, we've actually seen increases. And the CDC just released some data in the past year that showed that we've actually had an increase of 24% overall of suicide deaths, and that the rate has gone from about 10.5 per 100,000 to about 13. So the base rate is still low. This is not a common event that happens to everyone all the time. But again, this is something that is of concern to us, and we do think that media and journalists can play a positive role in that. One other statistic that, as we talk to schools, we do a lot of work in schools, that we've noticed that there are changing trends, and among those are that young females tend to be increasing in their risk, and we've seen actually a tripling of the number of suicide deaths of young females, but those rates are increasing. We also know that no state or no community is immune to suicide. So Ohio tends to be fairly average in terms of lives lost. We do know that rural communities are more at risk than urban communities, for example. But we know that this is a considerable problem, and the trends kind of mirror national averages. We look at it's the first leading cause of death of those 10 to 14, and the second leading cause of those of 15 to 24, for example. And this is a time when individuals tend to be at their healthiest. So when you see a cause of death like this, we should be, we should be addressing it as a public health problem. Also, another statistic that's interesting is that we lose twice as many individuals to suicide than we do to homicide. So this is another sort of interesting point that we want to make to let people know that the type of attention and the positive solutions that we need are really required, and really what we want this to be a start for that. Additionally, I think the other piece is, even though we're not concerned at this particular point with the financial terms, we lose $1.7 billion per year in the state in terms of lifetime medical loss and other costs. But it's not very expensive in the grand scheme of things to intervene early and to use prevention strategies that matter. So both school-based prevention, journalism work that can be done, means restriction, use of crisis services, and all these expansions. So we would like to focus on some of the positive things that we can do over time. I want to talk about a few myths, and I just highlight a few of the most common myths that are that we hear on a day-to-day basis, so that hopefully in your work these are myths that are not reinforced. There are a lot of stories that we see as we go through suicide reports in newspapers and television programs that emphasize these myths. So we would like to make sure that these are traps that are not falling into. One myth is that most suicides happen suddenly without warning. So although there are impulsive acts and young children are prone to impulsive suicide, we know that the majority of suicides have been preceded by warning signs, and that it tends not to be a mystery. It tends not to be something that's inexplicable, or that usually if there were signs, either verbal or nonverbal, meaning perhaps a person was giving away their belongings, possibly they had posted information online. And again, this point is not to blame anyone who encountered some of these warning signs, but that we can learn from it and move forward and figure out how to help the next set of individuals who show these warning signs. A couple of the other warning signs would be making sure that seeing a person who's gathering ways to harm themselves, lethal means, giving pills or weapons, or making statements to that effect. And we want to make sure that we can respond supportively. Another myth is that journalists should avoid covering suicide altogether. So obviously we're here as a group, and we think it's actually very important that journalists cover suicide in ways that promote support recovery and a humanizing story of what suicide really means to an individual in their community. Most people who are thinking about suicide don't really know where to turn for help. They may feel terrible about themselves. They may feel like a burden. They may feel like there's nothing they can do and there's no one that can help them. And what we think that really good stories can do is show that there are different ways, there are different people and networks and social support out there to make that hopelessness less of a reality for a person who's experiencing that. And that recovery is possible. And that stories that involve mastery of a crisis, and that stories that involve ways of helping people understand what to do next in an urgent situation are the stories that can provide some hope and movement forward. Myth: once someone's already is suicidal, he or she will always remain suicidal. So know that acute suicide risk, or that crisis period, does not last forever. It's not this interminable period that a person stays at their darkest state. It's almost this period of constriction and hopelessness, and a lack of ability to see beyond that point. But that crisis, if you are able to support a person and give them those resources at that time, a person is often able to navigate through that period of time. So really it's important to know that suicidal thoughts are not permanent, and that most people, in fact 90% of even the individuals who make a suicide attempt, do not ultimately die by suicide. So it's important to give the people resources to help them navigate through the process. Someone who has thoughts about suicide is determined to die. This one's, I think, a very important one to focus on. Most suicidal people do not want death. The idea is that if you're suicidal, you must want to die, because that's the logical conclusion that follows. But most people who are suicidal want intense, for them, unending emotional pain to stop. So one of the things that I've seen like a metaphor to convey what this means is, if you sat here and did sort of a yoga chair pose for a period of time, and you could do it for a while, you could deal with the pain, and then a little bit later, I'll speed up the pace, but it would start to burn, and then eventually you would stop and you would have to fall down. And it's not because you wanted to fall down, it's not because you wanted to lose the ability to manage this pain. It just became something that could not be managed with the resources that were available. So access to emotional support at the right time can prevent suicide. So we want to make sure we get individuals understanding the emotional component of this. And so I'll turn this over. I will just introduce myself really briefly. I'm a clinical psychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and I've been working on a grant. I wanted to thank the department, the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, for allowing us to put this grant together to work with journalists to help in a truly collaborative way work together to find the best way possible to report on suicide. My 3 F's are a father, foodie, and a fan of sports, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you all and my collaborator, Nerissa Young from Ohio University. And I will let her introduce herself.
So why am I involved with this grant? It's a fairly short spiel. I work with one of the most high-risk populations out there, and that's college students. I'm the advisor to all of the incoming freshmen to the School of Journalism, and so I'm helping them make that transition from mom and dad and everything that they know into an area where they know very little about what's going on. And this is something I think about, that I worry about, and I deal with every day. Yesterday morning, I had an email from a student, actually from a care provider, saying, just wanted to let you know this student is seeing me, and it is on a continuing basis. The student's not in class. I had another email from a student, again, just yesterday, saying that I've been overwhelmed with feelings of depression, and I've been internalizing them, and it reached a point of critical mass. So I'm now getting the support that I need. So this is something that I deal with on a regular basis. And I do care about my students, and so I worry about them. So that's why I'm here. The pitch on the flyer is, if you could save a life, would you? And the answer to that is obvious. Yes, we all would if we could. Well, the other part of that is we do have the power through good journalism to point people in the right directions and potentially save their lives. And why would we not want to do that? So that's why I'm a part of this grant. So, why are you here? Journalism influences society, obviously. And that's why most of us are involved in it. Journalism gives voice to the voiceless. I was at the Region 4 conference over the weekend, like Journalism Church, and we're all getting together talking about it. And people are talking about voice to the voiceless. I hear that on a regular basis. I've said it myself a few times. Journalism affects people. Journalism affects journalists. And I think that's sometimes part of the equation that we forget, is that when we take somebody else's story into our lives and our psyches, we are also affected. So one aspect of this grant is the self-care, that you need to take care of yourselves. Obviously, those of you who covered what happened here on your campus just a few weeks ago, may be dealing with some feelings and you're not exactly sure what's going on. You think maybe there's something wrong with you because what you had to cover is continuing to have an effect on you. No, that just means you're 100% human and mortal like the rest of us. And there's not a thing wrong with that. In fact, I'll be worried about you if you weren't having some of those feelings and some of those concerns. So there's an element of self-care That's part of what we're talking about in this workshop. So the resources that we're talking about, that we're hoping you'll refer your readers, listeners, and viewers to, are ones that you may also take advantage of. And at least 2 of the profiles on livethroughthis.org that you saw from Desiree Stage are of journalists. One was an Associated Press foreign correspondent in Russia, people who try to take their lives. So better reporting can help families and communities begin recovery. Those are the reasons we're here. That's why we're talking about this important topic.
You didn't give them your chronic give a damn line. I like that one. Journalists always suffer from chronic give a damn syndrome, so I figured we could put that in our diagnostic catalog. I like that one in particular. But I think I think we really are coming together for reasons. Everyone's got their own reasons to get into this field, and I've actually been struck by how much overlap there is between journalism and the mental health field in certain characteristics and traits in terms of supporting others, learning about things, learning how to do things, and moving forward with difficult topics. So I think there is a natural partnership that I'm hoping that we can continue to maintain. So one of the main sort of theoretical pieces that we just want to talk about briefly is this idea of suicide contagion. The science behind suicide contagion is not perfect, but we do have enough evidence at this point to understand that there is this phenomenon called suicide contagion, whereby if an individual or a community experiences a suicide death, and that there is an increase among those who both know the individual and those who consume the reporting that follows this suicide death. So it occurs in a period generally within several days to several weeks following a suicide death, and the community does seem to be impacted in a way that the risk of everyone around them, in particular youth and young adults, are most at risk for this contagion phenomenon, and that's when a certain behavior, in this case suicide or suicide attempts, increases following that event. So journalists do have a role in whether or not that increases or decreases based on some strategies that we're going to talk about. And then we also know that, again, that youth tend to be most at risk. And at this point, there are over 50 studies that confirm that this does, in fact, happen. So it's a building literature base, but like all scientific fields, it needs to be replicated, and the specific pieces are important to look at. Some of the evidence that we have for this is that we know that adolescents who are exposed to a suicide in their lives are have about a 3 to 5 fold increase in rates of suicide attempts following a suicide. We also know that when a suicide occurs in a community, and this could involve the expanding social media community, the risk for all individuals can increase. So there are these things called suicide clusters, which may involve either in a specific community or a specific time frame. So if there's a celebrity death, for example, within a certain time frame, there tends to be an unusually high number of suicide deaths relative to what you would expect during that time period. So you're looking at this existence of a spike or a spate at this period of time. Now, it doesn't account for, we don't want to use words like epidemic. Typically, it occurs usually for us a small amount, up to about 5% of overall suicides are responsible from a contagion perspective. But these clusters do exist, and we are concerned about them, especially when you talk about a high school suicide death or some of these other things where you would not expect to see 3, 4, 5 suicide deaths in a community in a given time. The other piece is that we've understood that based on certain features of how a media reports on a story, there can be either increases in a suicide based on the number of reports, the type of reporting, the way it's reporting, the types of details included. There are specific studies that show that does impact whether there are future suicides at a population level. We're not very good at picking out individuals who might be at risk for contagion. So the science is definitely not far along say like this person or this person, but we know that rates overall in a community can go up. We also, on a positive note, we're getting to the point where we're starting to know how we can help. What are the things that we can include in our reporting that may reduce the rates of suicide in a population based on a type of story? So, if we look at, for example, after Kurt Cobain's death in the Northwest, they actually followed guidelines that were available. They didn't sensationalize it. They limited certain amounts of reporting. They included a lot of resources and hotlines, and in fact, they did not see a major contagion effect. So, despite the popularity that he had and the types of ways that could have been reported, that actually didn't show an increase. Whereas previous reports, things like Marilyn Monroe, other major stories, you did see pretty significant increases in death when individuals identified with that person. The theories behind it real quickly are that if individuals, especially young people, are identifying with the person who died by suicide, they tend to see it as a way of attaching themselves to that person. They see it potentially as a way out of their emotional pain. If they're already vulnerable, if they're already dealing with mental health issues, then they may see either the community's reaction, or they may see their own solution being mapped out for them. So this identification, this ability to connect with the person is very important. The other piece is if a person in their community or your family dies by suicide, it's incredibly stressful. There's an emotional component to this. It's very hard and overwhelming. If you happen to already be struggling in any sort of emotional capacity and a person that you know or can identify with dies, then that is certainly very difficult. And then the other last piece that we see is if a person sees suicide as something that they are capable of, or that's sort of seen as them as a more, feasible option, then they are able to remove that barrier that might stop them otherwise if they were not able to see themselves as capable of doing this. So those are the main ideas. I just wanted to put that out for you to understand how we're thinking about this. Some of the specific pieces that we are fairly clear can lead to increased contagion at this point based on multiple studies are that when you have front page exposure in terms of newspaper coverage, bold, sensationalistic, top of the fold type of headlines, that's problematic. When there's details or method included in that very bold opening and things like that. And if you were dealing with social media, if there were pictures and graphic pictures of details and flashy short headlines or tweets with very graphic or method-oriented material, that would be problematic. Details and descriptions of method, repetitive reporting on the same suicide. So if you have, it doesn't mean, again, that there should never be a report on it, but there's specific research that shows the higher the number of reports on the same suicide, the more likely it is to cause this contagion or increase the risk for a community. And then romanticizing or glamorizing it, saying that was a noble way out, that was the person's solution, at least they're in a better place. These sorts of almost like cliches, like Nicole mentioned, would be things that we want to stay away from, and simplifying to a single cause. So can anyone report or tell me a cause that they see a lot? Bullying, right? So they even actually have a name for it now, bully-cide. Bola said that person was bullied to death, or there are certain populations, whether it be veterans, LGBTQ individuals, that they love to link that one causal factor, like that's the reason that they died by suicide. And we want to stay away from that. Suicide's complex, and it involves multiple factors coming together. So simplifying it suggests that if this one thing happens, then suicide will follow. That's a very unhelpful message, and it has been linked to contagion. And then that's stories that relay some of those common myths that we went through previously. So now that we're dealing with a social media world, we've got more and more opportunities for the same stories to be repeated over and over again. So the opportunities to see the same type of issues are pretty boundless. We've also seen multiple live stream suicides in the past several years, and several of youth that were just occurred earlier this year, and that's problematic. And that, again, you can You can take those pictures down. Social media platforms tend to be slow in responding to that and resistant to taking these things down, but that's a concern. We know that changes in what's going on in a person's feed and what a person is exposed to on social media does affect their actual online behavior. So getting repeated negative messages or positive messages will actually affect a person's tendency to post negative or positive material. And when you have a larger social network, when you have lots of material, we haven't quite figured out how that's going to affect contagion. We don't know exactly those details of whether people who have increasingly large social networks, whether that's going to be more likely to identify with those individuals or less likely. Stories can go viral. People are not exactly the most compassionate online. Have you ever noticed that? That sometimes there's stories, and if you look at the comments section, there's not always the most sympathetic folks who are, as they say, trolling around that area. So the likelihood that if a person's putting stuff out there that's emotional or sensitive, that just gets ripped apart or really treated poorly is fairly likely. So are we monitoring our comments and things like that? On the positives, even though these stories can be viral, there's lots of potential for contagion. I think there's almost limitless possibility for stories to be told that can make a difference, with stories that can tell ways that people have recovered, resources that are available to help those who are dealing with an emotional crisis, and we're starting to learn of a lot of social support networks and opportunities for people to connect with resources. So those are really important points, and I will turn it over to Nerissa. That was my hope.
That was your cue. So it's suicide failure on someone's part. And I think a lot of times those are the feelings and the emotions that people are dealing with as a result. And as reporters, again, and Professor up here kind of scooped me a little bit, that whole notion of the why, that's what our job is, right? What was the cause? Figure it out, and somehow we're going to, get rid of the problem. I don't know, we've done our job for the day. The why is not always easy to determine. And the young man up here, he lost a friend in high school. He said 4 years later he still doesn't understand why. The why may never be known. So we need to stop spending so much time, effort, and resources focusing on trying to answer a why, a question that we likely will not be able to comprehensively answer. And then superficially answering, we actually may do more damage than good by identifying as a single cause. So what are some of the things that we need to be focusing on instead? Okay? The other parts of the story. So think in terms of good journalism, think in terms of the comprehensiveness of the person's life. Think in terms of the types of stories that you can do to talk about suicide as an issue, not sitting around waiting for a death, and accessibility to mental health services. Do you know why it's so? Why the rate of suicide is high in rural areas? Because they don't have those support services that people in more populous areas do. So there's not an opportunity to catch things and get that person connected to support and treatment at a time. So let's redirect that energy that we would spend trying to answer the why and put it into being more proactive. So we know what the challenges of social media are because we're dealing with them on a regular basis. You have to feed the beast. If people log into your website 3 hours after they looked at it the first time for the day and they see the same material and the same arrangement, they're not going to keep coming back. So we are driven by this. In some ways, I think we're almost the dogs chasing their tails. And, even when we get dizzy and we fall down, we just get back up and keep going around and around and around and around again. The reporting in real time, that's what we're doing now in tweeting and in Instagram and in Snapchat. Follow-up is difficult. As a species and as an industry, journalists and journalism have not done a very good job in following up the day 2, the day 3 story and trying to help establish some context and make our reporting more valuable to the community that we serve. and also the economy of the medium. 140 spaces and character. You're going to put a link there. You're going to post it with a photo. Makes it difficult to provide that context, especially when images are equal to or better than words. We want to look at pictures. We don't want to spend a lot of time reading. Plus, with our mobile devices, most of those aren't set up to read long chunks of gray. So you've got to, put it in a very short headline. You can only have 2 or 3 main words, and then try to put those 2 or 3 main words, use the rest of the words that you have to put those into some type of context. Analytics drive coverage. If you don't pay attention to clickbait, you're going to get left behind. Nobody's going to be looking at your site. And so you want to be a destination site where people are coming. So these are the things that you're fighting against in the industry every day in your newsrooms. And you are the ones, now that you know, see, that's why coming and learning is a dangerous thing. Because once you learn something, you're responsible for it, aren't you, Professor?
Yes.
Yeah, and you kind of have to do something about it. And so now that you know, you're going to be the ones to make those cases to your editors, to your supervisors, to say, hey, this is not responsible, this should not go, or I need 20 more minutes before I put this information out in the public domain to make sure that this message I'm sending is one that will not indicate or suggest that contagion is an answer, or that someone else taking his or her life is an answer, etc., etc. And then finally, you're responsible for what you retweet, because when you pass along that information, whether you think of it consciously when you do it, amounts to an endorsement. So if you look at a bad example of suicide coverage and you send it on to the people who follow you, you are telling them, those who are not sophisticated journalists, that you think this is okay, this is a good example, and you're putting your stamp of approval on it. Now, I know as journalists we're supposed to be private people and have our own private lives too. Yeah, to a degree. But with the freedom of the First Amendment comes the responsibility of the First Amendment. And that we are responsible for the speech that we give audience to and that we pass along. So, yeah, it may be interesting. Yeah, people may want to look. But when you retweet it, as a private citizen, people also know that you work for campus media. Columbus is not that big. I know one time I was taking some people to the airport and I took the wrong turn on 270 and I was embarrassed because I don't live here, so I didn't know. And somebody said, oh, we're lost. And I said, yeah, but it's Columbus, so we won't be lost for long. It's not that big. Okay? But people know. People know. And as you move out into your community media, they will know who you are. So you do have that responsibility. So what does the SPJ Code of Ethics say that relates to this topic we're talking about? We need to balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort. You got a copy of that in your packet. Provide context. Don't misrepresent or oversimplify. When you're promoting, so you're sending out that tweet to tease people to read your copy. When you're previewing, when you're posting the first line or two on Facebook, and also when you're summarizing that story. Make sure you're showing compassion for those affected. That includes your whole community, not just those who personally know the one who died. Avoid pandering to lure curiosity, even if others do. We want to look. We're ashamed of ourselves, but we want to look. Don't be somebody who's passing along just what people want to look at, and it has no value. Think about the long-term implications, the permanence of publication. You can take down the page, and when somebody clicks on that link, it'll come up, page 404B error. Anybody done that? You can't find the page. But the link lives forever. The link lives forever. It will still come up when you run a search with those key terms. And that 2 or 3 lines, that's the tease that goes along with that link, whatever it's titled, that's there too. So you cannot ever get rid of it. Keep in mind what you're putting out there is going to be out there forever. Make sure you provide updated and more complete information as appropriate. Again, we don't do a good job of follow-up. We're not good with day 2, day 3, week 2, week 3 stories, because I tell people, journalists are like puppies. We have short attention spans. A ball bounces across in front of us and we chase it. 5 minutes later, another ball bounces the other direction across in front of it, and then we chase it. You know, shiny objects catch our eyes. We're kind of like crows in that regard. Ooh, ah, you know, we want to take it back to our nest. So we have to be careful that, you know, we're not just bouncing from here to there, and people think that all these events are happening in an isolated silo. Something drops from the heavens, you know, boom, it hits, and then something else, and there's no relationship to it. Everything's related to something else. So what does the AP Stylebook say specifically about suicide coverage? When written, there's no obligation to write one. Should not go into detail on methods, so no information about methods. Don't use the term committed suicide unless it's a direct quote. Use these phrases: killed himself, took her own life, or died by suicide. Again, the word commit implies a crime. Now, I recognize that people from the Catholic tradition, suicide is considered the unpardonable sin, okay? But we're talking here about people's lives, and you know, I'm not trying to take anybody to church or take anybody out of church. I'm just saying this is a different context of what we're talking about here. And we don't want to use a term that indicates that this person who is dead is also an outlaw. That does not serve anything. Please never use the term unsuccessful suicide attempt. Use attempted suicide instead, because unsuccessful suicide attempt makes it sound like this person is such a loser that he or she cannot even kill himself or herself correctly. That's the stigma that language imparts. And people will be reading it, that person and that person's friends, loved ones, neighbors, etc. Please, please, please let us not tag someone that way. So why don't we cover it at all? Here are the guidelines that the AP Stylebook says. You don't, or attempts, unless the person is well known or the circumstances are particularly unusual or publicly disruptive. So a public place. I will not discuss in detail unless somebody asks me about the Lantern's coverage. I did read it. As a former campus newspaper advisor, I am not going to single out students for criticism on something like this. I will respond to questions that are asked, but I do not think you could ignore this, okay? Where a student...
We did have this discussion.
Yes.
Where they didn't want to run a story
Yeah,
originally.
like I say, I'm not here to
Well,
criticize.
we'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because we did have this discussion, and we had several people who felt that we shouldn't have covered it, and then we had people who said when you jump off the parking garage, you have to cover it.
I think in this case, there was an obligation because it took place in a public place. I meant the details of the coverage. I think there was an obligation to recognize it and deal with it. The campus newspaper at Ohio University, at this point, I don't know if they're going to change as a result of us having done the workshop down there, but they ignore it. Anything that may be a suspicious death, they completely ignore. So if there's toxic mold in a residence hall room and a student is carried out on a gurney, but nobody ever knows, nobody asks any questions, I'm not sure that serves the student body either. If there was a domestic violence crime, and again, students see somebody taken out on a gurney, they hear the sirens, they see the first responders there. You know, simply ignoring it, I don't think is the answer either. Obviously, suicide rates are going up, not down, so ignoring it is not the solution. So a public place, an extremely unusual manner, although still, you know, really, I'm not sure that even an unusual manner warrants that type of coverage, but certainly not in every instance. And I don't have the answer for every instance, because anybody who thinks that there's one answer for everything in journalism is seriously deluding himself or herself. But we're offering what we think are best practices and things to think about. Because as I always tell students when I'm teaching ethics, you have to have the discussion. And it sounds like you all did. So, again, think about the public health issue. We don't ignore Zika just because it's uncomfortable. We don't ignore cancer. We don't ignore heart disease and other public health issues. Why do we feel compelled to ignore suicide? Because it's awkward. Well, yes, it's awkward. Because people lose their lives. Cancer's not pretty either, and it's awkward. But we talk about it because we're trying to connect people to the resources they need to live their lives the best way they know how. So here's the rationale for why we're going to cover it. I'm not saying it's a good rationale. Hey, we just report the news, right? I have said before, if you don't want to be in the news, don't make the news. Don't do anything newsworthy. Everybody knows who it is, so it's hypocritical to hide it. Well, just because everybody knows doesn't mean that you need to record it for posterity on the internet. People want to know. Some do, some don't. We got it. We may as well use it. Oh man, that is one of the worst answers for covering something in journalism. And we do it. Good art. I remember when I advised the campus newspaper at Washington University, I had a sign up there on the bulletin board where the photo assignments were to be made, and it said, remember, art is our friend. Please make sure you make a photo assignment before you go out the door. It's a slow news day. We don't have anything else better, more interesting. If we don't cover it, we'll lose credibility. Cover it poorly, and I can assure you, you will lose credibility. And finally, a death is a death is a death. It's not. And we've got to shape this mentality, if we still have it, that a murder equals a suicide equals a traffic death equals a farm accident death, etc., etc. They are not equal. They are different. You have the psychology involved with the death, and then you have this separate set of psychology involved because the person has died at his or her own hand. So here's what we're asking you to do. And I always treat students as full colleagues. And I have open and honest conversations with them, and I'm going to have it with you. The real rub I had when I came on board with this grant was this whole idea of journalists being out there trying to pull people back from the brink of suicide. And I wanted to say to John, I'm not a clinician. Journalists are not clinicians. Okay, it's not our job to go out saving people from harming themselves. But then the more I studied and the more I learned and the deeper I got into the material associated with this and began to think about how I'm going to talk to other journalists, I came up with this idea. When they say go beyond, do no harm, what do I mean? The journalist is activist. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to go out and propose legislation. I'm not saying that we're going to work a suicide hotline. I'm not saying that we're going to put on capes and we're going to run around, and anyone who is engaging in any kind of dangerous activity, we're supposed to snatch them off the street and put them in a safe box so that they can't hurt themselves or anyone else. What I'm talking about here is we give information to people to help them be safe all the time. When we give them the weather report, when we give them the traffic report, when we give them the consumer report that there are bad tires out there being manufactured and sold, or this baby toy is defective. Those are all ways in which we actively share information to help people protect themselves. And what I'm saying to you is suicide is the same kind of thing. Taking a proactive stance to reporting about this issue rather than just simply waiting for the next death statistic to roll over and, oh, we've got to go out and do something with this. So, speaking of case studies, you have 2 in your packets. I'm going to let you go table by table since it makes an automatic group. And beautiful young lady who came in, will you come up here and join these 2 gentlemen? And I want to give you a few minutes to work through these case studies, both of them, and see what you will do with suicide coverage. You're supposed to develop 3 social media products as a result. You're going to tease your story on Twitter. you're going to do an Instagram, and then you're going to write an SEO headline, which would go on the web for the top of your story. Does anyone know what an SEO headline is? Okay, SEO is search engine optimization. And what you do is you use keywords that people who are searching for that information would be using. For example, we would not say Wexner Medical Center in an SEO headline. You would say the OSU hospital or one of the OSU hospitals, because that's the common keyword term that people who are looking for information about medical center at OSU would be using to look at. So spend a few minutes, read through these, have the discussion, and then we'll come back together and spend a few minutes talking about these as a big group. All righty, who wants to share? Who wants to share what you came up with? These are fake stories, right? Fake news, okay? Yeah, so, it's not going any farther than here except for those, who watch the recording. So who wants to share? Jess.
So our group, firstly, we struck the first one. We said the woman reported on it, actually. So
do that again, Jess.
then on video.
So we did the second one, and our initial tweet was.
Do you want to tell your rationale?
What should we talk about while we're in this first one?
You go ahead. I'll stop you when I want you to. Go ahead.
Well, for the second one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so for our tweet, we had the police responding to reports of a woman found with gunshot wounds near Berkeley County Courthouse would be our initial tweet. Our SEO headline would be woman found dead from gunshot wounds outside Berkeley County Courthouse. And the photo that we would have used would have been the courthouse exterior with crime tape, no body visible. But we think that our story probably would have been very little more than the headline too, just because a lot of these other, we would, of course, not have used the quote from Atkins. I told her it wasn't a good idea, we wouldn't use that. We wouldn't use that the gun was registered to her right away, because that doesn't really mean that much initially. But yeah, so we probably would. I'm not even sure we would have if she worked there right away, because I just don't want to imply links that oh my god, maybe she was fired or, again. So we would probably just have very little more than that headline.
Okay. All right.
So yeah.
Another group. Want to share from case study 1 or 2? Yes.
Well, we thought for the first one we wouldn't run it unless there was something like he tried to reach out to Veterans Affairs and they didn't help him with his feelings. We'd only do it in a way to raise awareness that there needs to be more help for veterans. And we would frame the story that way, not about him being paranoid or jumpy or anything like that.
Okay. All right. Do you want to share from number 2, case study 2?
We were unsure about that. We were still kind of talking between us.
Okay. Well, just give me a couple of comments that came up during your discussion.
Well, we didn't want to necessarily, we were unsure and pretty much knew not to say about anything about the affair, because then it's not going to be a story about the person who lost their life. It's rather going to be a scandal story, which you don't want to make someone's life feel like it was just someone's it's gossip.
Okay. This side of the room, we want you to feel the love too. Yes.
For the second one, for our tweet, said at 3 a.m. today, a woman identified as Trish Meadows was found with a gunshot to the head outside the county courthouse. And then for our search engine optimization, it was pretty similar. So 28-year-old woman found dead by gunshot wound outside Berkeley County Courthouse.
Okay. And then did you choose a picture for our Instagram?
Yeah, we did. The picture of the courthouse with the crime tape and without the body.
Okay. All right. This table. Anybody feel comfortable sharing? Okay. The reason I gave.
I think he was going.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We were pretty similar to the rest of the room. Probably wouldn't have. I think we all remarked some details from number 1, but all were we probably wouldn't run it. I think we had a simulation in our head of what it would look like. The second one, I might include that she worked for the county. it's a fine line between what details are pertinent and not. And same way with Ohio State covering something like, it matters whether she's a student or not, taking their own life. And I think the same thing is to be said in a public display. It matters if they're an employee or not.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of puts it into the realm of a public person. She
Right.
would be known because she works at
Yeah.
the courthouse.
I
And
think
also it occurs at a public space. My original thought when I wrote the first case study was that it was a no-go because it was so over the top. There's not even next of kin to notify. But students have, that's the beauty of case studies, some students have said, well, can murder be eliminated? And then there is the issue, which I think was an excellent point, about services for military veterans who are reacclimating after tours of duty, multiple tours of duty especially, trying to find a space and a place to be at peace. So, you know, there's no absolute yes, there's no absolute no, there's no one size fits all, but when you're having the discussion, you're at least asking some of the right questions. And that's what ethics is about, yes.
Well, I was going to ask Owen, did you guys talk about, like, would you say, like, she's just a former employee? Because I don't know, like, would you have said she quit 2 days ago? Or just, because I think you make a good point that she has connection to this space. That's probably why she was there, whether or not she took her own life or, you know, it was a homicide. But I feel like if that were to be included, just initially former employee, just leave it like that. I mean, I don't know, I would put that she quit 2 days ago. Because then people are like, well, why'd she quit? You know, and then you start jumping to conclusions. Initially, that kind of initial story, I would probably not. But
in the headline or in the entirety?
Well, like I guess like in the body at all. Would you think that like there were?
I think I would use it at some point.
Like that she was like quit 2 days ago.
Maybe I could leave that out and still have a tag to the county.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's probably the way to do it.
Yeah.
Right, former employee.
I mean, I think the hard part is we are trained to answer readers' questions before they ask them.
Yeah.
And so.
Why the courthouse?
Right. It's like all these questions will come up depending on the level of information that you put in. So you almost want to scale back the questions. The questions don't come up, but then the questions come up and then you didn't answer them. So it's this constant battle for you to do what you've been trained to do and be sensitive.
Yeah, I feel like if you turn that into an editor, they'd be like, well, did you ask like how long they worked there? What was their job?
What was the name of the dog?
Yeah, right. What was the name of the dog is the classic reporter. So I think Nicole's right that you kind of get into this situation where we have to rethink, understanding that there's a potential that like suicide is in play. So then you have to start scaling back. Not necessarily quit doing the reporting, but what you put out there initially probably has to be a little bit different when you feel that.
That's the nut graph. That's the nut graph right there. Is start thinking beforehand. It's going to affect your thought process going into the story. And then John gently reminded me that some of the things that you shared did mention gunshot wound. And that's method, okay? So again, when you're trying to rule what type of death it is, death by suicide, death by homicide, it can be tricky. So the day 2, the day 3, again, those become important. So don't wait. Day 2, remember we got a human being here. Think about suicide rates, warning signs, responses. These are like public service type stories that we would do with cancer or any other public health issue. Think in terms of doing issue stories so that you're not always necessarily trying to cobble all of this on to a story about a death, but that you're getting that out there and not waiting for a death to prompt it. Find suicide attempt survivors who are willing to talk. You probably do not want to crash the funeral. That is in bad taste. But in the days after, the people involved, community members involved, may want to come forward and share how they're trying to heal, how they're trying to recover, how they're trying to move forward with this huge void in their lives and this big unanswered cry for them as well. So it needs to be a continuing thing that we're talking about, okay? Because I know in a business, it's a one and done, moving on to the next story. Not when it involves suicide. It shouldn't be for any story in which there's a tragic loss of life. But, what are the definitions? What are the boundaries? When do we cover an attempt? When do we cover a death by suicide? That's so on and so forth. Tag every story, even if it does just have the bare bones of a cop shop type of report, police blotter type of report, please tag it this way so that those looking can at least get that much support, that much connection to resource before you move on. It's on the cards, it's in all the information that we have for you, to please include the bookmark, it's on there. Please make sure you include that tag as a standard SOP. So humanize, follow the guidelines, those 2 pages, show suicide as preventable, point to resources for coping with and managing the crises, educate, do those issue stories, talk about it, and make sure as journalists you are practicing self-care. This is the website that has all of the things that we have produced so far. One of the things that my students helped vet and prepare is we kind of have some that are good examples of coverage and some that are bad examples, in which I went through and I annotated the story. So there's a link to the story, and then I annotated, this is what they did well, this is what they did not do so well, and this is what was terrible. And the New York Post is the poster child for how not to write a story about suicide. But if you're familiar with the New York Post, you know that anytime you need a bad example, you can count on the New York Post. So it broke every rule in the guidelines. So there are some in which they did almost everything right, and others in which they did, a third right, 2/3 wrong. So I like patterns. So please make sure you take a moment and look through that. I think it will be helpful to student reporters, especially as they're finding their reporters' legs anyway, and then especially trying to deal with this difficult topic. We want to thank all the people who have been involved, and we especially want to thank you for coming. When I interact with students, I feel positively about the future of the business and the future of our country. The pressures on journalists have never been greater. The responsibilities of all the things you have to do with social media profiles and so forth have never been more numerous and more difficult than they are now. And it's going to be up to you, again, to take that stand in the newsroom with your editors, with your assignment editors, and so on and so forth, and say, this is not the right way to do it. We can cause harm. You're going to have to be the one to stand up, and it's going to be tough as the young cub reporter coming in, but I hope you will find the courage to do it because it matters. You may be the one saving the life of someone else because you do it. And then here are some other resources that you can connect to. Most of these are also listed on the resources page at the web portal. So thank you again for coming. We appreciate you, and we will stick around and take questions in one-on-one.